Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be, going through some excerpts from White Power,
Okay.
which is a 1967 book by George Lincoln Rockwell,
Right.
who was, as you know, a leading figure in the American Nazi movement.
Yes. Very, very controversial figure. And this deep dive, I think, requires a careful and impartial approach.
Yeah.
As we unpack Rockwell's core arguments and understand the context of his writing, and I think most importantly, try to grasp how someone could arrive at these viewpoints
Yeah.
that are so extreme.
Yeah, it's definitely intense territory.
Yeah.
I mean, we were dealing with a book filled with inflammatory rhetoric, racism, conspiracy theories. But remember, our goal is to analyze and understand,
Yeah.
not to endorse or condemn.
Right.
It's like we're conducting an intellectual autopsy,
Exactly.
dissecting Rockwell's ideas
Yeah.
and the evidence that he presents.
Yeah, we're going to examine the evidence and the context
Yeah.
and let you, the listener, draw your own conclusions.
Okay, let's unpack this. So Rockwell dedicates a significant portion of the book to what he perceived as societal decay in the 1960s.
Right.
He cites these seemingly random examples, like a nude scene in a Boston opera,
Okay.
a black beauty queen in Richmond, Virginia,
Right.
and even a play depicting a black Jesus with white disciples.
Interesting. So what's fascinating here is that Rockwell uses these events to paint a picture of a declining society.
Right.
He sees a breakdown of traditional values,
Mm-hmm.
the weakening of the white race, and forces working to undermine Western civilization.
He doesn't hold back on his criticism of the government either.
Yeah.
He criticizes spending on social programs, claiming that more money went to things like buying tuxedos for the poor than to veterans' assistance.
Right.
It's a recurring theme, this idea of government overreach,
Yeah.
misplaced priorities. He sees the government as complicit in this societal decline.
Rockwell viewed the government as actively promoting policies that harmed the white race and American society.
And it gets even more heated when he discusses, flag burnings and protests against the Vietnam War.
Right.
He's outraged by people burning American flags,
Yeah.
flying Viet Cong flags while American soldiers were dying.
Right.
He contrasts this with his own arrest for tearing down enemy flags,
Wow.
suggesting a double standard in the legal system.
So this reveals Rockwell's intense patriotism and anti-communism.
Yeah.
He views these protests not merely as unpatriotic, but as acts of treason, emboldening the enemy. He sees America in a righteous battle against communism and any dissent as a betrayal of the nation and its soldiers.
So Rockwell was clearly troubled by America's direction.
Yeah.
But before we dive deeper into, his ideology, let's explore Rockwell's personal journey a little bit
Sure.
to understand how he arrived at these extreme beliefs.
Yeah.
He wasn't always the firebrand leader we know him as.
Right.
He shares an anecdote about a 17-year-old beatnik
Okay.
visiting Nazi headquarters, seemingly searching for meaning. And Rockwell noticed young people yearning for purpose, but lacking direction. This raises an interesting question about how Rockwell's own search for meaning might have led him down this path.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting you bring that up because he talks about his own, investigative turn of mind.
Okay.
Using a childhood story about experimenting with dish soap as an example, he seems to have this, inherent curiosity
Right.
and desire to understand how things work.
Yeah, and this analytical approach extended beyond, everyday curiosity.
Right.
Rockwell was fascinated by natural laws and how they applied to human behavior.
Yeah.
He used a sort of Darwinian lens, viewing different groups of people much like animal breeds with inherent qualities that determine their capabilities
Right.
and social standing.
Yeah, and that brings us to the heart of Rockwell's ideology, which is his views on race and inequality.
Right.
He firmly believed that different races have inherent unequal qualities.
Right.
He even denounces human dignity as a liberal fabrication with no basis in natural law.
This is where things get incredibly controversial.
Yeah.
Rockwell's views on race weren't just about acknowledging differences, they were deeply rooted in racial hierarchy.
Right.
With the white race, particularly what he called the Nordic type at the top.
Right.
This belief fueled his entire ideology and led him to elaborate conspiracy theories, particularly focusing on Jewish people undermining the white race.
So let's explore this, Jewish question, as he called it,
Okay.
which dominates his writing. So he describes encountering anti-MacArthur sentiment in Jewish newspapers.
Okay.
which led him down this path to explore what he saw as a hidden Jewish world influencing society.
So for Rockwell, this seemingly minor event validated his suspicion that Jewish people weren't just a religious group,
Right.
but a distinct race with its own agenda. He saw their influence in media, finance, government,
Right.
citing the high percentage of Jews in communist leadership and among convicted spies as proof of a conspiracy to undermine Western civilization.
And he goes further, citing examples like an article in the Freiheit newspaper
Yeah.
about Jewish lawyers supporting the civil rights movement.
Right.
He even uses his interpretation of Jewish religious texts
Yeah.
to argue that Judaism inherently promotes anti-Gentile sentiment
Wow.
and world domination. He specifically differentiates between Ashkenazi Jews,
Okay.
who he saw as the primary instigators of this conspiracy,
Right.
and Sephardi Jews, who he considered less of a threat.
These interpretations are highly selective and deeply flawed.
Right.
He twists information to fit his narrative.
Yes.
Rockwell cherry-picked evidence, ignored context, and drew sweeping conclusions to solidify his belief in a Jewish conspiracy.
So this belief in inherent racial differences extends to black people as well.
Yeah.
He claims black people, particularly in America, are fundamentally inferior and incapable of reaching the level of white civilization.
Right.
He cites the lack of development in Africa before European colonization,
Right.
and the supposed inability of black nations to maintain high living standards as proof.
His argument ignores the achievements of African civilizations
Right.
and relies on a very Eurocentric view of history.
Right.
He uses the term Black Plague to describe black people, further illustrating his dehumanizing and racist perspective.
Clearly, Rockwell's views on race and his belief in a Jewish conspiracy were central to his ideology.
Absolutely.
But interestingly, he was also critical of both capitalism and communism,
Right.
feeling both were corrupted by Jewish influence.
He criticizes capitalism for prioritizing profit over production and craftsmanship,
Right.
blaming this on Jewish influence shifting focus from product to money.
Right.
He uses the analogy of a ship's crew being manipulated by a red Jew to mutiny to illustrate his point about class struggle and manipulation of the working class.
So he saw capitalism as prioritizing money over quality
Right.
and communism as a tool to exploit the working class.
Exactly.
So where did he think society should go then?
This critique of both dominant economic systems reveals Rockwell's desire for an alternative.
Okay.
He wasn't content with simply railing against the status quo.
Right.
He believed in a different path, a system prioritizing the white race and restoring what he saw as a natural order.
That makes sense given what we've already learned.
Yeah.
But we're out of time for this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
So join us next time as we unpack Rockwell's alternative system and his vision for the future.
Sounds good. So picking up from Rockwell's critique of both capitalism and communism, his alternative was National Socialism,
Okay.
which he believed was the only path to salvation for the white race.
National Socialism.
Yeah.
Most people associate that with Nazi Germany and place it on the far right of the political spectrum.
Right.
How did Rockwell see it fitting in?
That's a great question. Rockwell actually positioned National Socialism as the political center,
Okay.
advocating for a balance of order and individual freedom.
Okay.
He argued that modern society had swung too far left, with too much individual freedom, which led to a breakdown of authority and social decay.
Right.
National Socialism, in his view, provided a corrective restoring order and discipline while preserving individual liberties within a racially defined state.
So he saw it as the Goldilocks solution.
Right.
Not too far left.
Exactly.
But he was quite critical of existing political systems in America, wasn't he?
Absolutely. He saw liberalism as a weakness inherent in white people, believing it made them vulnerable to manipulation.
Right.
He also argued that conservatism, with its focus on economics, completely missed the point, failing to address the core issue of race.
He called out conservative figures like Barry Goldwater
Yes.
and Robert Welch.
Right.
And what about the 1964 election when Goldwater lost to Lyndon B. Johnson?
Rockwell saw that election as proof that focusing solely on economic issues was a losing strategy.
Sure.
Johnson won handily, especially among lower-income and less educated voters,
Right.
the very people Rockwell believed were most susceptible to manipulation.
So if both mainstream ideologies were failing in his view,
Right.
were there any figures he thought were on the right track?
He admired George Wallace,
Yeah.
the segregationist governor of Alabama who appealed to white working-class voters.
Right.
But even Wallace wasn't explicit enough about race as the central issue, which Rockwell saw as a weakness.
So no one was going far enough for Rockwell.
Exactly.
What was his proposed solution then?
He believed the only way forward was a racially focused movement embracing a national socialism and using revolutionary tactics to overthrow the existing power structure.
Wow.
Rockwell drew inspiration from historical examples like the rise of Nazi Germany.
Right.
This is where his admiration for Adolf Hitler becomes central to his ideology.
Wow. Calling for the complete overthrow of the American political system. That's extreme.
It is.
But he was writing during a tumultuous time, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, a lot of unrest.
Right.
Maybe he felt drastic measures were necessary.
That's an important point to consider. Those events were creating a lot of anxiety and fear.
Right.
And Rockwell tapped into that.
Yeah.
He positioned white people as victims under attack
Okay.
and needing to fight back for their very survival.
And that's where Hitler comes in.
Right.
He saw Hitler as a model for the kind of leadership needed for this revolution.
Exactly. Rockwell praised Hitler as a visionary leader who understood the power of race and the threat posed by what he perceived as Jewish influence.
Right.
He argued that Hitler's success stemmed from addressing the anxieties of the German people and utilizing revolutionary tactics to gain power.
It's chilling to hear Rockwell praising Hitler,
Yeah,
considering the horrors of Nazi Germany.
it is.
I mean, it's one thing to advocate for National Socialism as an ideology,
Right.
but to embrace a figure responsible for genocide is deeply disturbing.
And it's even more shocking considering Rockwell was writing in 1967, less than 25 years after the end of World War II, when the Holocaust was still a recent memory. His willingness to not only defend Hitler, but hold him up as a model for future action
Right.
shows how entrenched his ideology was and how readily he was willing to overlook the atrocities committed in the name of National Socialism.
Yeah. His beliefs were extreme
They were.
and troubling. But as we've seen, he wasn't just spouting random hateful rhetoric.
Right.
He had a specific ideology, a vision for the future,
Right.
and a plan to achieve it.
Right.
He truly believed the white race was under attack and drastic action was needed.
And he was a skilled propagandist, adept at using language and imagery to evoke fear and urgency.
Right.
He drew on historical examples, personal anecdotes, and even biblical interpretations to support his arguments,
Yeah.
all woven together with a narrative of impending doom and the need for revolutionary change.
It's a disturbing mix of ideas.
It is.
But as you said, understanding them is crucial to grappling with the legacy of hate and extremism in America.
Absolutely. Extreme ideologies don't emerge in a vacuum. They arise from particular social and historical contexts, tapping into existing anxieties and fears.
Right.
Understanding these underlying factors is crucial to effectively counter such movements.
Well, there's a lot to process.
It is.
Let's take a break here and come back next time to delve into the final part of our deep dive into white power,
Okay.
where we'll explore Rockwell's specific ideas for achieving his revolutionary goals.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our final segment, Exploring White Power. Last time we left off with Rockwell's admiration for Hitler and his call for a revolutionary movement in America. He seemed to have a very specific vision for how this would play out. Did he offer any concrete strategies in the book?
He did. Rockwell outlined what he believed were the 3 essential elements for a successful revolution: leadership status and an understanding of power dynamics.
Leadership makes sense. He clearly saw Hitler as the ideal model for a strong leader. But what did he mean by status in the context of a revolution?
Rockwell was very interested in social hierarchies and the human desire for status and recognition. He used the example of a street game where each member is vying for position and fiercely defends their place within the hierarchy. He believed a successful movement needed to harness this innate drive. Individuals would be incentivized to contribute and rise through the ranks based on their efforts. It's almost like gamifying the revolution.
So it's about tapping into that competitive spirit and giving people a tangible way to see their progress within the movement. What about the third element? Understanding of power dynamics. That sounds pretty complex.
Rockwell was a student of history, and he believed that revolutions followed predictable patterns. He argued that anyone who wanted to overthrow the existing power structure needed to understand how power works, how to exploit weaknesses, and how to effectively use propaganda and agitation. He even suggested that violence might be necessary to achieve revolutionary goals, advocating for the idea that the ends justify the means.
That's pretty chilling, especially considering his admiration for Hitler's tactics.
Huh.
But he didn't just focus on the theoretical aspects of revolution, right? He had some concrete ideas about how to restructure American society. He proposed something he called an honest economy, for example. What was that all about?
Rockwell believed that both capitalism and communism were fundamentally flawed. He saw them as systems that benefited parasitic elites at the expense of the working class. His honest economy emphasized production craftsmanship and the elimination of usury. He wanted to reward hard work and eliminate financial speculation and manipulation.
It sounds like he envisioned a return to a simpler, almost pre-industrial economy. But how practical was that, given the realities of a modern industrial society? Did he address issues like automation or global trade?
Not really. His focus was more on outlining broad principles than on practical implementation. He seemed more concerned with creating a system that he believed would benefit the white race than with addressing the complexities of a modern global economy.
It seems like we've seen this pattern before, with Rockwell, big on ideology, not so strong on practical details. But let's talk about something else that seems central to his thinking. He clearly understood the power of propaganda and messaging. He even defended the use of the swastika, a symbol that to most people represents hate and genocide. Why would he choose such a controversial emblem?
Rockwell claimed that the swastika was an ancient symbol that had been unjustly tarnished by its association with Nazi Germany. He claimed it represented positive values like strength, discipline, and racial purity. He even went so far as to say that its use was a deliberate provocation, a way to shock people into confronting what he saw as uncomfortable truths.
Wow, that's a bold move. To try and reclaim a symbol so widely associated with one of the most horrific regimes in history. Do you think he genuinely believed he could change public perception of the swastika? Or was it more about attracting a specific type of follower?
It's probably a bit of both. He was a master of propaganda, and he understood the power of symbols. Using the swastika would attract those already sympathetic to his cause while repelling those who weren't. It was a way to draw a line in the sand to clearly separate his followers from everyone else.
It's a fascinating and unsettling look into the mind of a true believer. He was willing to embrace symbols and tactics that most people would find abhorrent, all in the name of his ideology. And speaking of tactics, we need to address his call for violence. He argued that violence was sometimes necessary to achieve revolutionary goals. Did he ever specify what kind of violence he was advocating for, or was it more about creating a climate of fear and intimidation?
While he never explicitly endorsed specific acts of violence, his rhetoric was clearly designed to incite and legitimize violence against those he perceived as enemies. He presented a world where white people were under attack and argued that they had the right to defend themselves by any means necessary. This type of language can be incredibly dangerous, especially when directed at vulnerable groups or individuals.
It's a stark reminder that words have power. They can be used to incite hatred and violence. It's important that we recognize the warning signs, call out this kind of dangerous rhetoric, and actively work to counter these types of extremist ideologies.
Examining white power isn't about endorsing Rockwell's views, it's about understanding them. It's about recognizing the patterns of extremism, the methods used to recruit and radicalize, and the very real dangers of unchecked prejudice.
It's been a heavy deep dive for sure. We've explored the dark side of American extremism, a world filled with hate, conspiracy theories, and calls for violence. It's a world that can feel distant and unreal, but it's a world that exists and continues to attract followers. And we need to understand it if we want to effectively combat it.
And as this deep dive has highlighted, the fight against hate is never truly over. It requires constant vigilance, critical thinking, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths.
So as we conclude our exploration of white power, we leave you with a final question to consider. How can we as individuals and as a society effectively counter the forces of hate and extremism and ensure that the dangerous visions presented in this book never become reality? It's a question worth careful consideration, open dialogue, and a commitment to building a more just and equitable world for everyone.